The Great War lasted just 2 hours, 120 minutes, enough to destroy cities, bring down societies, and erase entire swathes of history. But the truth is that the world as we know it wasn't swept away in 2 hours, under the devastation of bombs. It began to slowly crumble many years earlier, and the Great War was only the final act, the last straw that broke the camel's back. There was a period, 25 years long, in which the entire world shattered piece by piece, when every single step we took led us toward total destruction, a long era of bitter conflicts that preceded the day of the apocalypse. What were later called the Resource Wars, invasion of Mexico. It was the mid-21st century when all the major world powers were faced with a reality they had stubbornly ignored for years. Global oil reserves were dangerously depleted, and there were still no viable alternatives to replace them. Every country knew it was racing against time, and every barrel of oil consumed was a step closer to societal collapse. No oil meant no transportation, no energy, and no industrial production. The United States was probably the first to experience the thrill of this looming danger. In 2050, Americans saw all the oil fields on Texan soil depleted, one after another, suddenly deprived of one of the nation's greatest resources. Fortunately, there were still thriving reserves in the Alaska region, but they were nowhere near enough to meet the needs of an ever-growing nation. Forced to look around for a supplier, they turned to their southern neighbor, Mexico, which still possessed many fully functioning deposits. However, the scarcity of global resources had caused the value of black gold to skyrocket to unprecedented heights, and when the Mexicans proposed their price, the United States became furious, accusing them of exploiting their dire straits to rob them. Unable to negotiate a favorable offer, the United States soon reached a conclusion as pragmatic as it was chilling. If the Mexicans didn't want to sell them oil at a favorable price, then there was no other option than to seize their deposits, whatever the cost. In reality, the American strategy was very intelligent, if ruthless. In response to the failure of negotiations, they imposed extremely high tariffs on Mexico, which imported numerous essential goods from its northern neighbors. The inability to obtain the same supplies elsewhere soon led the nation's economy to deteriorate under the weight of rising prices and the scarcity of products. Mexico lacked the social stability of the United States, and the collective unrest soon erupted into numerous protests and violent riots against government agencies. It was at that point that the United States made its move, the one it had planned from the beginning. Citing the escalation of violence spreading throughout its neighboring country as an excuse, it began sending large numbers of troops under the pretext of protecting its own borders. Gradually, those same forces began to set foot on foreign soil under the pretext of helping the Mexican state quell the ever-increasing revolts and, above all, securing its precious oil reserves. From that point on, it didn't take long for the United States to gradually gain military control of all areas of interest for the oil fields, completely cutting off the Mexican administration. Weakened by citizen protests and the massive tariffs that were crippling its economy, the Mexican government realized it was too weak to stand up to the U.S. military. Thus, by 2051, the U.S. military had taken control not only of the nation's precious oil fields, but also of all major infrastructure, effectively turning Mexico into a new colony completely subject to its influence. Checkmate. The Euro-Middle East War. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the political and economic landscape is changing profoundly, and behind the scenes, there are those who silently observe, arranging their pieces and waiting to make the first move. Since its founding, the European Commonwealth has become a global superpower. High levels of industrialization, a massive army, and a robust economy, but it is also extremely dependent on imports and has insufficient internal resources to sustain its energy demands. Thus, when the taps of its old trading partners begin to turn off, Europe finds itself more vulnerable than it ever imagined. A government incapable of guaranteeing energy loses one of the pillars of its legitimacy. The result is protests, strikes, rationing, and a market in panic. But all is not lost. The Commonwealth government has watched the Mexican occupation campaign with attention and interest, and the message sent by the United States has been perfectly understood. The rules have changed. If resources are lacking, just take them elsewhere by force. Thus, the eyes of all Europe turned eastward, to the Middle East, and its still rich oil reserves. Up until that point, the Middle Eastern states had been playing a dangerous game of bidding war. Like Mexico, they had taken advantage of the delicate global situation to impose a radical increase in the price of oil per barrel. But unlike their counterparts, they boasted a rich economy capable of financing massive military forces. And so, until then, they had resisted the political and economic assaults of national forces interested in its resources. However, Europe had no intention of waging a false campaign like the US. Having deployed its forces along the border, their intentions were clear. No more negotiations. Hand over control of the oil fields to us, or we will take them by force. Thus began the war. But it was a very different one from those the forces in the field had experienced in the past. It was not a quick conflict with limited objectives. months. The European government was likely hoping for an extremely quick war, just long enough to occupy the oil reserves, perhaps without encountering too much resistance from the smaller Middle Eastern state. But that wasn't the case. The opposing coalition proved extremely resilient, and not a single piece of land was ceded without massive losses on both sides. The United Nations attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution, but in response, many member states, facing dire straits due to the shortage of oil reserves, decided to abandon the organization, which effectively ceased to exist within just 3 months. Meanwhile, the lightning conflict had transformed into a full-blown war of attrition. In 2053, Tel Aviv was reduced to rubble by a nuclear terrorist attack of unclear origin. This led both sides to accuse each other, initiating an exchange of attacks with low-yield nuclear warheads that only increased the number of casualties. It was at this stage of the conflict that both powers saw a clear pattern unfolding before their eyes. Neither side has any intention of giving up. Neither wants to be the first to fall. The first to find enough reasons not to continue will lose. And with this in mind, a terrible strategy is implemented first by the Middle Eastern forces and then by Europe itself. It's no longer a matter of grabbing the few remaining resources. Both sides know that whoever retreats will face the inevitable collapse of their society, and neither has any intention of being the first to fall. Thus, the first sabotages begin. The reasoning is better to destroy than to leave in enemy hands. In the final months of the war, the European Commonwealth is falling apart, with the smaller nations beginning to crumble under the weight of the war effort and the total lack of raw materials to support their economies. The Middle Eastern coalition has become a sieve, a devastated zone under constant military control. Oil fields are being blown up like firecrackers by bombings from both armies, and the damage is incalculable. By 2060, Europe is on the brink of collapse. Many internal governments have fallen, and the European Commonwealth is virtually non-existent. The Middle East has become a bombed-out wasteland, and the oil fields that sparked the conflict have been destroyed or exhausted, exploited to the last drop to prosecute the conflict. Between 2060 and 2077, there are scant references to functionally intact bits and pieces of British and European cities and states, as well as the post-war period. But while people may desire for an official version of Fallout London, it's unlikely that how the mod depicts it and how the world of Fallout describes it will ever truly coincide. The war is finally over, but there is no winner. Alaska under attack. By 2066, the world had already entered the most chaotic and destructive era in its history, and no one was exempt from the disastrous effects of war. China was the second superpower on the global stage after the fall of the European Commonwealth, but like Europe and the United States, despite, or perhaps because of, its size, it was no longer able to supply its population with oil and many other essential resources. The People's Republic of China had always been a solid power, largely thanks to its vast territory, which had allowed it access to a vast quantity of minerals and resources, including coal, which for decades had been the nation's energy pillar. However, just as had happened with oil, these mines had also been exhausted under intense extraction, and now China found itself deprived of all its major sources of livelihood. Until that point, America itself had been an excellent trading partner, but the old agreements had become meaningless. After consolidating its presence on Mexican soil, the United States found itself facing two new crises. The first was a mysterious, extremely viral and deadly disease that began to spread throughout the nation, the New Plague, which propaganda portrayed as an attack by some foreign force intended to destabilize American society. While the New Plague's impact on American society faded away to almost nothing, it still generated immense panic, not unlike a certain real-world situation a few years ago. The second was the brutal war between Europe and the Middle East, which it was feared would spread to overseas nations. It was in this tense climate that the government's highest echelons initiated a series of strategies aimed at maintaining internal stability, launching two projects that would profoundly shape the world of Fallout: the development of the forced evolutionary virus to counter Chinese bioweapons, as well as the New Plague and the launch of the Safe House project, which would lead to the construction of vaults throughout the country. In line with its new isolationist policy, the United States decided it was crucial to strengthen its defenses in Alaska, currently the most valuable oil reserve available. After all, they had seen how easily another superpower had seized on its campaign to occupy Mexico and would not allow anyone else to turn its own strategy against them. However, to reach Alaska, it was necessary to cross Canadian soil, and the government of the nation to the north did not look favorably on the entry of large foreign military forces within its borders. Relations with the United States had always been excellent, but what had happened in Mexico was a clear warning bell that had significantly shaken trust in its old ally. So America did what it did best. It threatened massive sanctions in the form of trade tariffs. After all, they had the perfect excuse. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline ran through Canada, allowing oil supplies to reach American soil. It was simply the right and duty of the United States to send military forces to protect the viaduct to prevent sabotage and tampering by opposing factions. After all, the Canadians also received supplies from that same structure. It was a necessary military action in the common interest. Unable to resist the political pressure, the Canadian government finally relented, agreeing to the entry of a limited number of military forces. But this was only the first step, and it was now clear that America would no longer have any qualms about disposing of its neighbors as it saw fit if the situation required it. Having blocked most imports to concentrate the resources on domestic needs, America began to focus its attention on the development of new energy and military technologies, even developing the first prototypes of portable fusion cells for civilian use. In just a few years, the United States had become a true energy fortress, perfectly capable of surviving the pressing global crisis. But every fortress inevitably creates an external enemy, and wealth often attracts unwanted attention. China, cut off from oil supplies and feeling threatened by America's new drive for scientific development, decided that the only way to avoid a slow internal collapse was immediate military intervention. Despite American preparations, in December 2066, the Chinese army successfully landed on the coast of Alaska and quickly occupied vast swathes of territory, even reaching Anchorage, the state capital, a strategically vital point for controlling the oil fields. The U.S. Army was well positioned, but it was powerless against the ferocity and sheer size of its forces deployed by China. Canada itself thwarted American defense efforts. Still smarting from the experience with the Trans-Siberian Viaduct, it initially refused to allow the reinforcements needed to counter the Chinese advance to pass through its territory. This decision forced the United States to break the blockade and allow its forces to pass through foreign soil to advance towards Alaska. This move sparked the first demonstrations of discontent among the Canadian civilian population. In any case, the new reinforcements immediately proved effective, especially thanks to the use of one of the brand new superweapons developed by West Tech, the T-45 power armor. These fusion-powered warsuits turned the soldiers who wore them into veritable machines of destruction. Despite some mobility issues, the steel plates they were made of made them as durable as tanks. Furthermore, thanks to a highly advanced hydraulic press system, they allowed soldiers to lift and deploy extremely heavy weapons such as miniguns and rocket launchers with extreme ease, giving them enough destructive power to single-handedly annihilate entire enemy squads. But China did not sit idly by, and had no intention of being pushed back into the sea after all its efforts to grab the new territories. After the initial shocking impact, Chinese intelligence began an extremely rapid race to develop weapons capable of countering American dominance. There was even talk of creating its own version of power armor for direct use on the Alaskan front, but development was not completed in mass quantities, only in limited amounts. However, other projects did emerge, such as the implementation of lightweight and versatile anti-tank weapons, perfect for countering the robustness of American power armor. Additionally, the Chinese trained child spies and soldiers for infiltration into America by brainwashing and torturing them, infiltrating areas such as West Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Boston. Though efforts to sabotage Hoover Dam in Nevada were quickly met with the death of all Chinese insurgents involved, thankfully, the Chinese had also developed extraordinary stealth technology to counteract American robotics and energy weaponry development. The Chinese response was so effective that within a very short time, a clear situation emerged for both sides. They were at a stalemate. On the one hand, China was acquiring enough resources to postpone the collapse of its economy for the time being. On the other, the United States was relentlessly trying to gain ground and reclaim its lost deposits, but without success. The only notable result was the massive loss of life on both sides. The annexation of Canada. Despite recent invasive actions by the US military, America and Canada are still allies, or at least on paper. However, the cumbersome armed presence of their southern cousins is increasingly restricting the Canadian people. The seeds of discord have already been planted, and it won't be long before they begin to bear fruit. Soon, the first demonstrations aimed at expressing popular dissent over the fragility of their government's choices and the desire to expel the foreign army from their borders. But at the time, no one could imagine that this was only the beginning of something darker. The situation exploded in 2072. Having managed to bypass the strict US military controls, some dissidents attempted to sabotage the Trans Pipeline. The precise affiliation of this group is unknown. They were likely Canadian protesters intent on demonstrating against the occupying power. But there was even talk of Chinese infiltrators attempting to cut off the United States from Alaskan oil supplies. In any case, rather than being detrimental to the Americans, this maneuver proved to be the perfect opportunity. The pretext was unassailable. Following the clear attack on the viaduct's security and the Canadian government's inability to prevent similar attacks, the United States had no choice but to send in new military forces to ensure the protection of its resources and the safety of the Canadian people. On that occasion, the words of General Buzz Babcock, commander of US forces in Canada, became historic. Effectively immediately, United States troops are beginning a complete takeover of all Canadian assets and resources. Little America is ours, but let's face it, it always has been. That was the first time the term was used to refer to the Canadian nation. And from that point on, its slow dissolution began. In reality, Canada's annexation wasn't a real war, but a slow assimilation as insidious as it was total. By then, the presence of U.S. military forces on Canadian soil had stripped the nation's government of most of the strategic areas for territorial control. As protests subsided under military pressure, Washington even decided to begin exploiting Canada's enormous natural resources, arguing that given the enormous economic and military cost incurred by the U.S. to protect Canada from the Chinese invader, it must contribute somehow to the war effort. In this way, the United States secured access not only to mineral and oil residues, but also to timber reserves useful for building structures and fortifications, rare earths, uranium, and above all, direct logistical access to the East Pacific. Not to mention all the top-secret military and scientific projects that Canada was secretly working on, such as the production of highly advanced robots to be used for civilian security and to support military forces on the battlefield. Piece by piece, Canada was stripped of its sovereignty. Former decommissioned military bases were converted into U.S. command centers, many government buildings were dismantled, and martial law was even declared in areas deemed high risk. As the war with China continued with no end in sight, the United States decided to exploit the media narrative to transform the conflict into a propaganda tool. From this perspective, the annexation was gradually presented as a liberation. The U.S. media began to broadcast images of the brave American soldiers protecting the Canadian population. Cartoons, comics, and entire advertising campaigns were produced to portray what was effectively a genuine occupation as an act of generosity and brotherhood towards their northern cousins and allies. The American military had become the true heroes, while the Canadian partisan resistance was demonized as extremists and enemies of order. But the truth was quite different. Canadian society was oppressed by U.S. forces. The protests were bloodily crushed, and rioters were arrested or even executed on the spot. Entire communities were crushed under the weight of the soldiers' brutality. Meanwhile, the American machine was also moving legally, officially declaring the occupied Canadian provinces unincorporated U.S. territories. A pompous way of saying that those territories would never join the Union, but would instead be governed directly by Washington under military administrators who would maintain martial law. Canada was no longer an independent state, but a nation within a larger and stronger nation. A true little America, the liberation of Alaska. But let's return to the war front. In 2074, the two forces were in perfect balance. Neither was able to drive the other from Alaska, but China undoubtedly had the upper hand. Having occupied the oil fields, it was extracting black gold at a relentless pace, and then shipping it back to the motherland. The Americans, on the other hand, saw their precious resources being stolen from under their noses, unable to deliver the final blow to drive out the invader. Furthermore, China was not only devoting its forces to the war effort, numerous spies were secretly infiltrating American society, attempting to seize control of strategic positions of power and trying to bring down the United States from within. Numerous attacks and conspiracies were foiled, but just as many were successful. Chinese agents were spreading discontent among the population, which already resented their nation's violent actions against former allies, and the excuse of the ongoing war no longer seemed a valid justification. The highest levels of the U.S. government were well aware that drastic action was needed, something that would change the course of the war. The reasoning was simple. The Chinese are not just invading us, they are also endangering our very internal stability. It's time to repay them with the same medicine. Armed with the new material and human resources obtained from the annexation of Canada, the U.S. military carried out an operation aimed at dividing the Chinese forces and bringing the war directly to their homeland. Thus, a large fleet of ships was sent overseas with the task of occupying Chinese soil and blocking the passage of supplies from Alaska. The strategy was partially effective. China found itself fighting on two fronts, forced to choose between preserving its newly conquered oil fields and defending its territory from the relentless advance of American forces. In such a heated war, both sides began to play their most powerful and dangerous cards in an attempt to land the winning blow that would change the course of the conflict. China focused on biochemical weapons, attempting to develop viruses that would annihilate the enemy army. America, on the other hand, deployed genetic oddities, monsters created in laboratories with the specific intent of annihilating every enemy force on the battlefield. This is how the Death Claws, the forced evolutionary virus, and many other aberrations that would later spread across the post-apocalyptic world first appeared. There was even an attempt to deploy the infamous and feared Liberty Prime, an iron giant with the destructive power of a warship, but the project was not completed in time. The turning point finally came in 2076 with the introduction of the new T-51 power armor. Thanks to this new model, much more durable and agile than its predecessors, American soldiers now possessed not only enormous firepower, but also the ability ability to attack and reposition quickly, thus evading enemy return fire. Pressure from this new military might, Chinese forces had no choice but to retreat, losing ground day after day, until in early 2077, Anchorage was officially liberated from foreign control, thus ending the Chinese occupation of Alaska. Towards the end, it could have been the end. The enemy defeated, the oil fields recovered, the military stronger than ever before. The United States could have stopped there, retreat once more, as it had in the past, and this time with all the credentials to advance its society without having to worry about the resource crisis. But when you achieve something, it's easy to start craving more. The US government had seen a new political horizon and new heights of power to conquer, and it would not step aside before achieving them. Instead of withdrawing its troops from Chinese territory, it continued its campaign of conquest. Many of the soldiers who had been deployed in the war to reconquer Alaska, and who had been promised a glorious return home once the operation was completed, instead found themselves deployed overseas on the new front in mainland China. The Chinese army, now in retreat, had no choice but to withdraw its lines, allowing the Americans to occupy large swaths of their immense nation, reaching as far as the Gobi Desert and the banks of the Yangtze River. However, this move sparked discontent among the American population. Protests against the current US government's unscrupulous, almost tyrannical behavior had never subsided. The war was clearly over, and Americans were tired of this endless struggle. Their only desire was to see their children return home and resume the peaceful, safe life they had always known. Clearly, this consensus was unacceptable to the government forces, who had no intention of settling for what they had achieved thus far. Now deprived of the main narrative weapons that had previously fueled the propaganda machine and kept general discontent at bay, the government attempted to direct public attention to a new critical target, a treacherous and invisible enemy, yet one so fearsome as to justify extreme action. Paranoia was the weapon they decided to adopt. They tried to convince the population that the war wasn't truly over, but had infiltrated their homes, their neighborhoods, and even the people they knew best: Chinese spies, insurgents from Canada, terrorists from Mexico. The new enemy wasn't armed with a rifle and bulletproof vest, but his weapon was his words, and his goal was to incite revolts against the established order. Having sown doubt among its citizens, the government launched a series of cruel strategies to stem the problem they themselves had created. Actual labor camps were created, where all those suspected of conspiring against the United States were locked up. They were supposed to be prisons for spies and terrorists, but the truth is that they quickly became confined to protesters, rioters, and any other individual who opposed the new policies. Many citizens of Chinese origin were brought there under the pretext of being infiltrators, but the truth was that doubt and paranoia were so widespread that simply having the same physical features as the enemy was easily blamed. There were numerous protests and demonstrations to oppose these inhumane conditions, but the government had no qualms about violently suppressing them, as it had done in Mexico and Canada. Soldiers returning from the war in Alaska were even sent in their power armor to pacify the dissidents, but many of them resolved to rebel against their own commanders. After the exhausting operation to recover the oil deposits and the endless war on Chinese soil, they had no intention of returning home to fight against the very citizens they had sworn to protect. The situation soon escalated nationwide. Discontent with the army's performance was compounded by protests over the lack of jobs. As new technologies brought automation to industries, tens of thousands lost their jobs. The first riots broke out over the lack of basic necessities and the poverty rate, which had reached unprecedented levels. One by one, the squads sent to contain the unrest joined forces with the protesters themselves, forcing the government to declare a very strict martial law in an attempt to regain control of the nation. But without them realizing it, the United States was now racing frantically toward the abyss, and the slightest thing would have been enough to undo the efforts of all those years of conflict. When it became clear that the situation had reached a critical point, pressured from all sides by widespread dissent and by resistance groups entrenched within the annexed nations, the government's top officials, including the president himself, decided to implement their final defensive solution, abandoning their government posts and moving to a highly equipped oil platform equipped with the most modern and advanced defense systems. From this position, they would not only be able to monitor the situation on US soil from a secure and unassailable location, but would also have full control of the oil rig with all the energy reserves they would ever need. This was the birth of what would later be called the Enclave. This move also had a very specific meaning. The president had abandoned the nation. The highest government positions had disappeared, leaving enormous gaps in the chain of command. The edge of the abyss had been reached, yet it would not be necessary to take any further steps. Just as what was once the United States of America was heading for collapse, destruction would reach them first. It was October 23rd, 2077. It's unclear exactly who pressed the button first, but suddenly, all the world's major nations decided to implement their own final standstill. It was 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time when the American Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System identified the first missiles launched by Chinese forces. From his impregnable bunker, far from the the impending disaster, the president issued his counterattack order. By the time the first American missiles were launched, bombs had already begun falling on Pennsylvania. Within 2 hours, the United States was reduced to a pile of radiation-contaminated rubble, and so was the rest of the world. The resource war was officially over. The Great War had begun and ended in just 120 minutes. What remained was only the rotten root of human overreach, a wound that 200 years later would still not be healed. Europe versus the Middle East, America versus Canada, America versus Mexico, America versus China. Every conflict at the time had seemed so important, so necessary for its own survival. So how was it possible to reach total self-annihilation? The resource war was nothing more than the result of a world that had stopped believing in cooperation, that had decided to look only at its own backyard, forgetting that everything is connected, nothing happens in a vacuum, and that every destructive action leads to escalations that affect us all. The truth is that the bombs only accelerated the process, but the world of fallout had been crumbling under the weight of its own hatred for decades. Because when humanity stops thinking about its surroundings and focuses only on its own survival, it stops thinking about tomorrow. And without a tomorrow, nothing remains but ashes. This has been every pre-apocalypse war in Fallout explained. If you would like to see Fallout's dumbest questions explained, click the video on the screen.